So the cranial nerve chapter was relatively painless, right? And hopefully the brainstem chapter will also be relatively painless. So there's a lot of great information in the book about the individual nuclei in the brainstem. We are not going to talk about that. We are really just going to hit the high points. And the learning objectives, very simple, list and define the 4 Ds of brainstem dysfunction. We'll talk about those, and I'll tell you which specific page on the book where those are listed. So you just need to know those 4 symptoms that start with the letter D and what they are. Okay? But we're going to talk a little bit about the anatomy and the components of the brainstem, just to inform you. So the brainstem is superior to the spinal cord and inferior to the cerebrum. So it's sort of connecting the top of the spinal cord to the bottom of the cerebrum. And the word pons in Latin actually means bridge. So from inferior to superior, the inferior part of the brainstem is called the medulla. The middle part is the pons, or the bridge. And the midbrain is the most superior part. The cranial nerves emerge from the brainstem, largely, except for a couple of them. It has in the book the connections, the 2-4-3 rule. 2 cranial nerves connect to the midbrain, 4 to the pons, and 3 to the medulla. You don't have to remember that, but hey, it's a nice little thing, 2-4-3. If you ever do want to remember where the cranial nerves connect, there's your little mnemonic device. So the brainstem serves 2 functions. There is some processing done there in the individual nuclei in the brainstem, but it's also a bridge from the spinal cord to the cerebrum. And so sensory, autonomic, and motor vertical tracts travel through the brainstem. Some of them continue through the brainstem without alteration, so there's no processing that's done on certain ones. There are some cross over to the other side in the brainstem. Some already crossed over at the spinal cord level. So when we're talking about vertical tracts, the brainstem acts as a conduit for that information. So that's one of the functions of the brainstem. We talked in the somatosensory chapter about some of the divergent tracts, the spino-reticular tract, where it went from the spine to the reticular formation. Well, here's the reticular formation. It's a neural network within the brainstem that includes reticular nuclei, their connections, and ascending and descending reticular pathways. The job of the reticular formation is to integrate sensory and cortical information. So we just talked about vertical tracts in the brainstem that just basically are a conduit going through. There's actually a lot of processing that goes on in the brainstem too, and some of it happens in the reticular formation. So it combines the information descending from the cortex and ascending from the sensory system, the somatosensory system, and it helps to regulate somatic motor activity, autonomic function, and consciousness. And it also plays a role in modulating nociceptive pain. So the reticular formation is part of the pain matrix that we talked about. Okay, so just kind of bringing everything together. So a lot of the things that we talked about in the vertical system section, we are going to sort of bring them together now in the region section and try to make a more complete picture, if that makes sense. So the reticular nuclei, there are several nuclei within the reticular formation that regulate neural activity throughout the central nervous system using neurotransmitters and neuromodulators. So the major reticular nuclei, and I'm not going to quiz you on these, but we're just going to briefly talk about them because neurotransmitters are made in these areas. The ventral tegmental area, the VTA, the Pedunculopontine nucleus, the PPN, the Raphe nuclei, and the locus coeruleus and medial reticular area. So just introducing those terms, you really don't need to memorize them or anything, but we'll talk about which neurotransmitters are made in each area. So the ventral tegmental area contains most of the neurons that produce dopamine. So they're in the midbrain, in the substantia nigra, which is part of the basal ganglia circuit we've already talked about, and in the ventral tegmental area, which is part of the reticular formation. So in Parkinson's, it's the substantia nigra cells that are dying off. So there's still some other cells that create dopamine, but we have just a vastly decreased amount of dopamine in our system, and that's what causes the symptoms of Parkinson's. Activation of the ventral tegmental area affects some different areas that produce the feelings of pleasure and reward. So morphine is habit forming because it inhibits inhibitory input. So it's that double negative again into the ventral tegmental area. So we have this area that is being inhibited on a regular basis, sort of like we talked about with the basal ganglia. And in order to get a different effect from it, it has to be disinhibited. So it inhibits the inhibitory inputs. Crazy, I know. So certain drugs or certain other things can disinhibit the ventral tegmental area, producing more dopamine and feelings of pleasure and reward. So when we have things like either drugs or activities or whatever that increase feelings of pleasure and reward, we are more motivated to do them. Makes sense, right? So the PPN, or the Pedunculopontine nucleus, produces acetylcholine. It's located in the caudal midbrain. And ascending axons from the PPN project to the inferior part of the frontal cerebral cortex and the interlaminar nuclei of the thalamus. So really what we need to know about that is that there are areas in the frontal cortex and the thalamus which involve motor control that use acetylcholine. So the PPN influences movement, and we know acetylcholine is the major neurotransmitter that works at the neuromuscular junction. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter. It also works in other areas of the brain, in the emotion system, the limbic system, the reticular areas, and in the thalamic areas. So the globus pallidus is part of the basal ganglia system again. So you can think of acetylcholine as being related to movement, and it's being made in the Pedunculopontine nucleus. The Raphe nuclei are the ones that produce serotonin. They're mostly found, most of those cells are found along the midline of the brainstem. So the pontine Raphe nuclei, which are in the pons, modulate neural activity throughout the brainstem and the cerebellum. And we know that serotonin has a big effect on mood and motivation. So there's also some effect on activation of interneurons and motor neurons. So these neurotransmitters also act as neuromodulators, and you can see the main reason I included these diagrams, aside from the fact that they're cool looking, but the main educational reason that I included the diagrams is so you can see the widespread effects of all these different neurotransmitters in the brain. So the locus coeruleus and the medial reticular zone are the areas that produce norepinephrine. Most of the norepinephrine in the CNS is produced in these areas. So they project throughout the brain and spinal cord. So the medial reticular zone produces both norepinephrine and epinephrine to help regulate autonomic functions, projecting to the hypothalamus, the brainstem nuclei, and the lateral horn of the spinal cord, where we find those autonomic tracts. So a lot of the neurotransmitters are produced in the brainstem, and then they go out in the cerebrum and the rest of the body to produce their effects. So the other thing that the reticular activating system controls is consciousness, awareness of yourself and surroundings. It governs alertness, sleep, and attention. Remember how when we talked about the spinal reticular tracts in the part of the divergent tracts transmitting pain signals that keep you up at night? So it's stimulating the area that governs alertness, sleep, and attention. So we have nociceptors in the periphery stimulating this area. Brainstem components include the reticular formation and the ascending reticular activating system. So the ascending one, it's areas from the brainstem that stimulate something in the cerebrum that's going to cause an action somewhere in the cerebrum. So the reticular activating system is also highly involved in attention. So what you pay attention to versus what you don't. So, have you ever had the experience where you get a new car and it's let's just say it's a blue Toyota. We'll say it's a blue Toyota Camry just for fun. And then all of a sudden you notice all over town, you see blue Toyota Camrys, and you go, wow, I didn't know this was such a popular car. But you've actually activated your reticular activating system to be more aware, to be more alert to that blue Toyota Camry. So a lot of the times when you are more aware of something, it's your reticular activating system that is focusing your attention. Pretty cool, huh?